In this quick video, I want to talk about the dangers of risking too much on any one stock trade, particularly when you're trading a system like a long-term trend following system that has a large number of small losing trades and a small number of large winners. So what we've got here is the profile, the trade distribution profile of a typical trend following system. Details of the system don't matter, but basically in any trend following system that you use, any system that cuts losses short and lets profits run, you're going to get a profile of trades like this. So you'll see on the right hand side a small number of very large winners, and this is where the bulk of your profits come from. Then you have a larger number of small winners. These are the ones that really help you break even. And then you've got a large number of small losses. And these are the things that basically chip away at your account. And this is where you really got to manage your risk day to day. Now, the key thing that you can notice if you look carefully here on the very left hand side is the worst single trade in this entire backtest lost 5.1 times the intended risk. So what this chart represents is the number of trades on the left-hand column and the R multiple, which is the number of the trade return as a function of the amount you intended to risk. So if you intended to risk $1,000 and you won $2,000, then the R multiple is 2. If you intended to risk $1,000 and you lost $1,000, then the R multiple would be -1. So this losing trade over here on the very left-hand side lost 5.1 times the maximum intended risk. Now, that's one trade out of probably thousands on this chart. But if that one trade existed in the backtest, then chances are that one trade, or worse, can also exist in the future in your system. And when you're managing your risk for a trading system, this is something you really need to think about, because you've got to make sure that your system will survive and you can profit regardless of what the market throws at you in the future. And the fact that this bad trade, this -5 R multiple trade, existed in the past means that it could come back and bite you in the future. So you need to make sure that the risk per trade that you take on takes into account the worst trade in your backtest. Now, just as an example, if you risk 2% on each trade that you took using this system, and that trade came along, this 5R loss, then your entire account would have been down by 10.2% just because of that one trade. Now, I don't know about you, but I want to make sure that my account isn't so sensitive or volatile to any one trade outcome. A single trade losing 10.2%, which, especially when I know that trade is there in the backtest and therefore potentially might come along again in the future, to me that's an unacceptable risk. So when you look at your trade distribution profile like this in terms of R multiples, you need to make sure that you're comfortable with what the amount that you're risking and what that'll translate to in terms of the worst possible loss. This is why I teach people that when you're doing trend following particularly, you need to risk much less than 2% per trade. Now, I know a lot of authors and educators out there talk about the 2% rule and blah, blah, blah. The reason people talk about risking no more than 2% is not because that's the right amount. It's because if an educator talked to someone and said, oh, you should risk 0.2% of your account on each trade, most people will be like, you're on drugs, because how can you possibly make any money risking so little? But the reality is most people actually don't have a clue how to make good, consistent profits in the market. And certainly most people don't understand how to stop themselves from blowing up when the market turns against them. So 2% is a very rough and actually quite aggressive guidance to stop people from doing really crazy things like risking 5 or 10% of their account on each trade. So the other thing to keep in mind, though, is that while this trading system generated a -5 R multiple loss, the worst case trade is often far bigger than the -5 R that we see here. Now, I've seen trading systems that I've tested and played with where the worst case loss was -10, -20. Now, you don't get very many of those, but again, you've got to be very careful with how you position size if those sorts of things come along. And what drives the very big R multiple losses in many cases is a really tight stop loss. So if you're using a really tight stop loss and you get a gap down or a gap against your position, then you run the risk of getting these big R multiple losses. So as as my account's grown and as I've adjusted my risk profile to be a little more conservative as I've progressed and really understood the markets, I've started to use slightly wider stop losses and also smaller and smaller position sizing for each trade, because that's enabled me to have the confidence that I'm not going to lose big money when one of those bad trades comes along. So that's all I'm going to talk about in this video, but I hope that's been useful, and I look forward to seeing your questions and comments in the video stream below.